Caitlin and Lucas seemed like the perfect couple. Neighbors called them the embodiment of harmony. He was always attentive, and she was calm and balanced. He was her support when she needed it. Their home in a quiet suburb became a cozy refuge from the outside world. They lived like many others, focused on the small details of everyday life, making plans and seeming happy. But behind this facade of well-being lay a shadow that only Caitlin knew about. In recent years, memories of her old friends, Emily and Sarah, increasingly haunted her. Those two were closer to her than anyone else. When she first started dating Lucas, the three of them spent evenings together in cafes, laughing and dreaming. They supported her when she had doubts, offered advice, and said things that no one else dared to say. Emily had always been her pillar, especially during the difficult year when Caitlin lost her job and her confidence wavered. Emily encouraged her, helping her find the strength to move forward, and Caitlin felt that she owed her friend her resilience. Emily's disappearance was a severe blow. She simply stopped reaching out. At first, Caitlin was sure that Emily would turn up, perhaps just caught up in her own affairs. But as days turned into weeks, and then months, her hope faded. She replayed every moment spent with her friend trying to find an explanation. This loss left a scar on her soul, and she couldn't shake the lingering feeling that she might have prevented it if only she had noticed the signs. 6 months later, Sarah disappeared as well. The pain of losing her second friend was as sharp as a knife. Just as with Emily, she searched for any answers but found none. The police uncovered no clues, and time passed, casting a dark veil of uncertainty and grief over her soul. Every night, lying in bed, she found herself wondering if there was someone in town who was abducting women, someone watching the people she loved. These thoughts grew more obsessive by the day. Whenever she tried to talk about it with Lucas, he would invariably change the subject. Her memories of her friends and their evenings together, their carefree walks and laughter, seemed out of place to him. Sometimes when she shared these memories with him, she noticed that he would become nervous, and in those moments he seemed almost like a stranger. Lucas gently but firmly convinced her that the past should stay in the past, that she was worrying over things beyond her control. Leave them in the past, Kate. They're simply gone. Maybe they found their own path, he would repeat with a warm smile, but there was something dark in his voice. At first, she tried to understand his point of view, but with each attempt, the conversation became more strained. She felt guilty for bringing up the topic, but her inner conflict intensified, as if her heart knew more than her mind. She tried to explain that this wasn't like them, that Emily and Sarah would never leave without saying goodbye. They were her family bound by a vow to always be there for each other. But every time she tried to express herself, Lucas remained unmoved. With a gentle smile that once seemed endearing, he reassured her, insisting it was all just her imagination. He said it with a strange certainty that left her puzzled, and each time, her sense of anxiety only grew. Sometimes she tried to convince herself that his reaction was due to jealousy, but that explanation seemed too simple to match her feelings. In those quiet moments when she was alone in their large house, a strange emptiness would come over her. She felt as if something was waiting behind the walls, lurking. The house, which was supposed to be a refuge, no longer felt safe. She found herself listening for the slightest rustle and the hollow ticks of the clock, which sounded ominous in the dark. Every evening, as they dined together, she caught his gaze and tried to read the answers that he seemed to be hiding. His eyes remained calm, but behind that calm, she felt there was something else. Sometimes his gaze grew heavy, and it made her flinch, though she couldn't understand why. He was still the same caring husband, with a warm smile and a soothing voice, but now this side of him began to feel artificial, as if he were playing a role. Days passed, but her sense of dread only grew. Caitlin realized that her life would never be the same. There were many questions ahead, and she knew she had to answer them herself. With each passing day, it became clearer her instincts were not mere paranoia, and if she didn't start seeking answers, she would remain a hostage to this shadow hanging over her home. Caitlin always felt a bit uneasy in the basement of their house. It was an old, half-lit space with a low ceiling and a lamp whose light seemed dim, as if fading in the stale air. The old staircase creaked under her weight, and sometimes she heard faint rustles in the walls, as if the house itself were watching her movements. Here they stored things they didn't need, everyday old furniture, boxes of documents, and faceless items from the past. That day, Caitlin was only looking for a box of winter clothes to prepare for the cold. Sorting through dusty boxes, she suddenly came across a heavy cardboard box standing in a far corner. Her gaze caught on it, and it seemed to her that it had been there for a long time, yet somehow it had never attracted her attention before. A strange feeling washed over her, as if someone had deliberately hidden it in this place. Caitlin took the box off the shelf and placed it on the floor. When she lifted the lid, a musty smell of old dust and long-forgotten things wafted up. Inside were nondescript items, some paper wrappings, old postcards, noticeably worn jewelry. She thought it might be a box of items left by previous tenants, but soon her hand touched a small silver necklace. She felt her breath catch. This piece of jewelry had once belonged to Emily, her missing friend. She remembered how Emily would often twirl it in her hands, talking about her dreams and plans. Inside the box were other familiar items, a Friends Forever card that she and Sarah used to give each other on birthdays, an old photo of them on a walk, a couple more pieces of jewelry. With each new find, an emptiness grew in Caitlin's chest, followed by fear. Images of their evenings together, moments of laughter and conversation, flashed in her mind. These items belonged to Emily and Sarah, friends who were no longer there, and no matter how hard she tried to find a rational explanation, it slipped away, leaving her in a dark void of uncertainty. Why are these things here? How did they end up in our basement? She closed the box, her hands trembling, and for a moment it felt as if the world around her shifted and lost its stability. Her first thought was to go upstairs and ask Lucas, but something inside her, a primal instinct, held her back. Perhaps she was afraid to hear an answer she didn't want to know. But in the end, Caitlin decided that her doubts were just an illusion. She went back upstairs, trying to appear calm, but the words she wanted to say were already spinning in her head. Entering the living room, she saw Lucas sitting in an armchair with a newspaper. Trying to make her voice sound steady, she addressed him. "Lucas, can you explain why Emily and Sarah's belongings are in the basement?" For a moment he froze, his eyes meeting hers, as if considering his response. His face remained calm, but she caught something fleeting, something elusive in his gaze. He put down the newspaper and said, "What are you talking about, darling? What belongings?" His calm tone threw her off. She couldn't understand how he could so easily ignore the obvious. "There, in a box. I found their jewelry, a photo, even a card." "You never mentioned that we had those things stored," she said, her voice trembling, though she tried to speak firmly. Lucas smirked slightly, a strange, barely perceptible glint in his eyes. He shrugged, as if it were completely insignificant. "They must have been left by the previous owners," he said with a coldness that cut through her heart. She tried to detect any hint of concern, regret, or surprise, but he remained serene and confident. "It's probably just a coincidence," he added, as if putting an end to the conversation. Those words didn't make sense. She knew every detail of those items, the necklace, the ring, the old photograph. These belongings had been her friends, and it couldn't be a coincidence. But Lucas's certainty unsettled her, as if casting doubt on her own perception of reality. "Maybe I really am imagining things," she thought, but the confusion and fear wouldn't leave her. She returned to the basement, closed the box, and put it back, as if this might help her forget that she had ever seen it. But the thoughts of those belongings and Lucas's cold gaze settled firmly in her mind, and she realized she wouldn't be able to let it go. Her inner world had turned upside down, and she began to feel that she was no longer safe in her own home. She was ready to erase many things from her memory, but this conversation marked the beginning of something inevitable, something that would haunt her. After the conversation with Lucas, Caitlin couldn't find peace. An unsettling feeling, as if someone had shattered her familiar world, haunted her day and night. She tried to calm herself, convincing herself that all these fears were just products of her imagination. But the more she tried to reassure herself, the deeper she understood that, deep down, she didn't believe it. Every time Lucas left the room or stayed out of the house, her suspicions grew stronger, consuming her. She began noticing things she hadn't seen before: his frequent evening absences, his curt answers to questions, the shadow of irritation that crossed his face when she asked too many questions. At some point, she realized that she could no longer stay in the dark. Her inner voice, either prompting or pushing her, told her that she needed to uncover the truth before it was too late. When Lucas calmly told her one evening that he needed to meet a colleague and might be out until late, she felt a wave of fear wash over her, and her heart pounded as if it knew this evening would be pivotal for her. She waited until he left and heard the sound of Lucas's car engine fading into the distance. After waiting a few minutes, she quickly grabbed a jacket, took her car keys, and followed him. Her hands trembled slightly, but her determination didn't let her stop. Caitlin knew she was going too far, but she couldn't turn back now. She drove slowly, trying not to attract attention, keeping a safe distance from Lucas's car. He drove through the entire town, turned onto a dirt road, and headed toward an old, abandoned building on the outskirts. Caitlin stopped a little further away, hiding in the shadows of the trees, leaving her car in the darkness so he wouldn't notice her. Exiting her car, she moved closer slowly and cautiously, holding her breath to avoid giving herself away. Lucas unlocked the old metal door with a key, and it creaked as if it were the only sound breaking the night's silence. Caitlin held her breath, watching him disappear inside the building. Her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. It would have been safer to stay outside, but the inner voice urging her onward wouldn't let her leave. As she entered the building, enveloped in darkness and almost complete silence, a wave of cold fear swept over her. The walls were covered in dust and mold, and the smell of decay and dampness permeated everything. Her eyes gradually adjusted to the darkness, and as she moved forward, she began to make out the shapes of old furniture, abandoned boxes coated in a thick layer of dust. Moving further, she stumbled upon a room where neatly stacked boxes stood on the floor. In one of them, she noticed items that suddenly seemed hauntingly familiar. Inside were photographs of women, different women she had never seen before. She picked up one of the photos. The woman in it looked like an ordinary passerby captured on camera while walking down the street or standing by a store. In each box, there were such photographs as if Lucas had secretly collected them, capturing each moment. Her heart pounded harder. She realized that these women weren't just random people. They might have been his victims. She saw notes, small scraps of paper where the women had left their memories, their names. Inside, she felt frozen with horror. Lucas wasn't just collecting items, he was collecting the lives of these women, as if they were his possessions. Perhaps her friends, Emily and Sarah, were only part of a whole network of women he had once stalked. Caitlin couldn't believe it, but the items, the photographs, and the notes remained undeniable proof. She grabbed one of the photos, trying to hold on to at least one piece of evidence and trying not to make a sound, hurried to the exit. Now it seemed to her that every sound, every rustle held danger, as if the darkness itself was watching her, condemning her for intruding on someone else's secrets. Returning home, she locked herself in the bathroom and took out the photo she had hidden under her jacket. In the photo was a young woman, no older than 20, with a smile and bright eyes full of life. At the bottom was the caption, "Friends forever." These words seemed to cut her from the inside, reminding her of her friends and their lost lives. She realized that this girl could have been as close to someone as her own friends had once been to her. The next day, gathering all her strength, Caitlin tried to talk to Lucas again, as if nothing had happened. She asked him about his night work, about where he had been, but his answers were cold, and his eyes once again appeared lifeless. In his gaze, she saw something she hadn't noticed before, a void hiding something she feared. Lucas gave short, evasive answers, and she realized he knew something. That evening, standing in the basement and holding the box with her friend's belongings, she suddenly understood the scope of everything hiding behind her fears. Her friends weren't just victims, they were part of something larger, something horrifying. With this knowledge, she realized her life would never be the same. The coldness seeping into her soul told her that the past wouldn't leave her in peace, and she would have to live with this knowledge. Ever since Caitlin returned home with the evidence hidden under her jacket, her fear had intensified, as if that discovery had revived her inner nightmares. She tried to act normal, but every gesture, glance, and movement felt false to her now. There was no longer any trust, and each time he entered the room or spoke to her, she was overcome with fear, not a panicked fear, but a deep, primal fear that lived somewhere inside her, like an instinct. It felt as though her mind had become foggy, as if the world around her had also lost its former clarity. All her efforts seemed futile, as if he already knew her secret. With each passing day, her suspicions grew. She began to notice how Lucas watched her closely, observing her reaction to his words. He had once been reserved, sometimes even gentle, but now there was something cautious in him. Sometimes when he caught her gaze, a strange shadow crossed his face, as if he knew she was beginning to understand something. Every evening they sat across from each other, and she trembled, realizing that the face with the cold, impassive expression no longer belonged to the man she once loved. She couldn't take her eyes off him, afraid that any movement might betray the truth. At night, Caitlin couldn't sleep. Her thoughts filled her mind like waves crashing one after another. Then one night, amidst the silence, she heard him get up from bed. She held her breath, not daring to move, feeling her heart pounding as if it knew something pivotal was about to happen. Lucas walked down the hallway and stopped in the kitchen. She followed him quietly, barely breathing. The darkness seemed to pierce her with its chill, as if it knew what she was about to see. Caitlin stopped at the doorway to the kitchen and saw him leaning against the table, his back motionless and his shoulders slightly trembling. Her blood ran cold when she heard his words. He was speaking softly, almost whispering, as if the words were meant not for her but for someone else. "Everyone has their secrets," he whispered, and Caitlin felt the words pierce her consciousness like needles. Her heart froze. What did that mean? Did he know about her suspicions? Fear gripped her. It seemed to her that his voice carried a threat, as if he already knew she had discovered something. She returned to the bedroom, not daring to stay in the kitchen any longer. It felt as if any sound, the slightest movement, might give her away. She lay in bed, afraid to move, until he returned. Her mind was in complete turmoil, as if an inner voice kept whispering that danger was near, that she needed to run, but something held her back. Every step she took now felt calculated, and every little thing in the house seemed ominous, as if they were trapped in a cage meant only for her. The next morning, Lucas looked at her during breakfast with an expression that made her uneasy. His gaze held a cold and frightening indifference. He didn't even try to act like the affectionate husband anymore. You know, sometimes it's better to leave certain things in the past, he said with a slight smile. These words cut into her consciousness. They sounded like a warning, a thinly veiled threat. She forced herself to smile in return, but inside she was already burning with panic. His gaze was piercing, as if he could see right through her, as if he could read every thought. An inner voice kept whispering to her that she needed to run, that she was no longer safe, but a desire to uncover the truth, to expose all his secrets, held her back. Every moment spent next to him became a test. The internal tension grew, as if she herself were a spring wound to its limit. Her thoughts became heavy and murky, and everything in the house, every little thing, filled her with fear. She nearly stopped eating, and sleep eluded her. In the rare moments when she closed her eyes, she saw only images of those on the photographs, memories of her friends who had disappeared without a trace. In the silence of the night, it seemed she could hear strange rustlings and faint sounds, as if the walls themselves knew something and were trying to warn her. Her own home, her refuge, had become a true trap. It seemed that everything around her had turned into a sinister symbol of her fears. She felt she could no longer stay silent, but at the same time she couldn't bear the responsibility of revealing everything. Each time he returned home, his cold gaze made her heart tighten with horror. Caitlin felt they were playing a game, where any wrong step could cost her life. Images of the boxes, the belongings, and the photographs flashed repeatedly through her mind. Now she could no longer doubt that he knew something, that he understood she knew too much. But there was still no open conflict between them, and that was the most terrifying part. She felt the tension growing between them, as if they were both waiting for the moment it would snap and the truth would come to light, however painful it might be. Caitlin could no longer remain passive. Her fear had grown so intense that it was impossible to keep it inside. She needed to know the truth at any cost. She decided she would confront Lucas directly, record everything he said, and use it as evidence. This plan seemed like the only way out of the nightmare she was trapped in. That evening, when Lucas came home, Caitlin was already waiting for him in the living room. She tried to remain calm, but her fingers trembled nervously as she kept her phone in her pocket, with the recording app turned on. She started the conversation cautiously, trying not to reveal her intentions. "Lucas, I need to talk. I want you to be honest with me," she said quietly, but there was determination in her voice. She knew he would either have to open up or completely destroy her trust. Lucas seemed to freeze for a moment, his eyes narrowing, but then he responded with a mocking smile. "What's on your mind, darling? What's troubling you?" His voice was soft, but Caitlin sensed something sinister beneath the tone, as if he already suspected what she was up to. She couldn't afford to let the moment slip, and her voice trembled as she replied, "You've been going out a lot at night, and lately. I found things you haven't explained." He leaned in, his eyes coldly glinting. "Things? What things?" Katie's words were too calm. A wave of panic swept over her, but she steeled herself. "You know what I'm talking about. Those photos, those women. I know they're not strangers to you." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper, but she knew each word was a challenge. She waited for him to say something, but his response was unexpected. Instead of denying or justifying himself, Lucas only smirked. His gaze was cold and piercing, as if he was savoring her fear. "Everyone has their secrets, Kate. Some things are better left unsaid." He spoke as though he wanted her to remain in the dark, but there was a hidden hint in his tone. She sensed he knew about her fears and was toying with her emotions, pushing her toward the edge of despair. Her hands clenched into fists, and she struggled to hide the horror that gripped her. Everything inside her screamed that she was in danger, that she needed to run, but her determination to stay and get the truth from him held her in place. You're enjoying this, aren't you?" she blurted, unable to suppress the tremor in her voice. Lucas tilted his head slightly, his gaze remaining piercing. He didn't answer directly, but the slight smile on his lips was the answer she dreaded. "You've always been so impressionable, Kate." "Maybe it's just your imagination," he said, never taking his eyes off her. His words seemed to tear her apart, and she realized that his pleasure in her terror was part of his game. He knew her fear paralyzed her, that she was trapped in her own fear and desire to uncover the truth. She suddenly understood that he had likely known about her suspicions for a long time, and that each of their conversations had been his way of testing her resilience. But this time she wouldn't back down. Caitlin felt that if she gave up now, she would never find the strength to stand against him again. Her inner monologue, filled with horror and hatred, transformed into resolve. She understood that this game he was drawing her into was his way of showing his power over her. But despite all the fear, she knew she had to end this. She barely held back tears as she stood, suppressing the trembling that overtook her. "I know what you've done, and I won't stay silent any longer," she said firmly, taking her first step toward freedom. She saw his expression shift for a moment, but he quickly returned to his usual icy calm. "Oh, and what are you planning to do about it?" he asked, as if throwing down a challenge. Her heart pounded, but she didn't let fear take over. She knew that first thing tomorrow she would hand over all the evidence to the police. This was her last chance to escape this nightmare, and she could no longer afford to hesitate. Even though the fear of his revenge loomed over her like a shadow, she was prepared to face anything. In that moment, her resolve was stronger than her fear, and she finally made the decisive choice that could change her life. When Caitlin handed over the recording and evidence to the police, she felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight she had carried for weeks had lifted from her shoulders. She watched as the police arrived at their home early in the morning, saw them search the rooms, their muffled conversations hinting that justice was on the horizon. In that moment, Caitlin felt that her long and torturous journey to the truth was finally over, and she had nothing left to fear. As they escorted Lucas out of the house, he gave her a strange, calm look, and Caitlin barely resisted the urge to look away. He slightly lifted the corners of his mouth, as if smiling, and coldly said, "Do you think this is the end, Caitlin?" His words pierced through her. She felt that even in those final seconds, he was managing to control her fear. She hoped she'd never see him again, but those words lingered, sinking deep into her mind like a warning. During interrogation, Lucas revealed himself as a master manipulator. He remained calm, confident, and cold-blooded, as if he had prepared for every question in advance. Like a skilled actor, he expertly steered the investigators into doubt, giving contradictory statements that seemed both plausible and misleading. He smirked and openly hinted at his innocence, claiming that Caitlin had simply succumbed to hysteria, and that all accusations were a result of her troubled imagination. Caitlin could see his manipulations taking effect, and fear once again wrapped around her, making her tremble. When they brought him to the scene to verify the evidence she had found, Lucas continued to confuse the police. He pointed to random objects, acting as if he had no idea how they had ended up there, causing the investigators to question every piece of evidence, as if they were just random coincidences rather than indisputable proof. "I don't even know how this got here," he said, looking straight into the investigators' eyes. The officers exchanged glances repeatedly, clearly thrown off by his composure. But the most terrifying part was how he used her to make everyone doubt her mental state. "My wife was under a lot of stress, convinced something was wrong. But everyone can feel that way. You understand, maybe it was just her imagination," he said, looking at her with a gaze full of feigned sympathy. He knew the investigators were listening and beginning to doubt her, and Caitlin felt her world crumbling once more. It was as if all her efforts, her fight for the truth, could be turned against her. Weeks passed, and every time Caitlin attended court hearings or gave testimony, Lucas continued to play his role. His gaze was cold, but in every movement and word, there was a sense of his confidence. He hadn't lost hope of being acquitted, and she realized that, for him, this wasn't just an attempt to escape justice, it was a game he intended to win at any cost. He skillfully used his charisma, addressing the court and jury with the assurance that Caitlin was on the edge, unable to distinguish reality from fiction. Caitlin could feel this game draining her. She felt exhausted, empty, as if she had been a puppet in his hands all along. Even his arrest no longer brought her peace, because every day he made her question her own words again and again. His arrest seemed like a victory, but in reality it was just the continuation of their struggle, and Caitlin understood that perhaps his influence would haunt her forever. One day, during another hearing, as he was brought in for questioning, Lucas met her gaze and offered a barely perceptible smile. She sensed that even here, surrounded by people, he remained the same, the one consumed by his game. A wave of dread washed over her. Putting him in prison might not bring her salvation. Perhaps one day he would be free. Perhaps he would find a way to continue his game. And this thought flooded her mind like ice-cold water. In the days leading up to the trial, Caitlin tried to find some peace, but her mind was gripped by fear. Now, she lived in constant anxiety, feeling as if Lucas lingered somewhere in the shadows, like a phantom, waiting for his moment. Her home, her sanctuary, had turned into a trap where every creak, every knock felt like a warning. Her nightmares became an endless reflection of her fears, Lucas stalking her, finding new ways to slip through, mocking her attempts to break free. She knew that even his arrest hadn't destroyed his hold over her. On the day of the sentencing, she felt hollow. It seemed as if the court's decision wouldn't change anything inside her. Despite all his cunning, Lucas was found guilty, but even that couldn't free her from his shadow, which remained, permanently transforming into her fear. She realized that her life would never return to what it was, that every day, every evening would be filled with that feeling, as if he were still there, despite the sentence.